Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place.
Well, this is a special day for the college. It's a special day for the state, a special day for the nation, and a special day for more than that. And Dex and I have been talking about how to deal with the day, and so you're going to see what the result of that discussion is. I'm going to go on for several hours, and Dex has about 5 minutes at the end. A special day, attention to the person and the memory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., enormous stature, significance to the history of this country and the meaning of this country, emerging in the 1950s in the turmoil of the Rosa Parks episode and the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, which successfully integrated Montgomery's city bus line. And within a couple of years, he formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which proved to be his base of organized operations over the next decade. By the mid-1950s, the nation simply couldn't avoid the issues raised by racial segregation in this country and the vast historic inequalities it had produced. African American service in World War II and in the Korean War screamed for fair and equal treatment of black veterans and their families, indeed for all black Americans. Post World War II economic changes, the modern development of the American economy, industrialization, drew increasing numbers of black Americans into a terribly important role in the success of that process. U.S. involvement internationally with the Soviet Union and China, presumably both in the march to communize the world, and the U.S. involvement worldwide to contain that presumed effort posed enormous dilemmas for a racially segregated America. Containment of communism in Africa and Asia rang hollow to peoples of color. How could America talk about the American exported virtues of freedom and independence for Africans and Asians while denying the same peoples of color in their own country? It was just simply indefensible. And so, as you know, amid challenges to legal segregation and political barriers to racial separation began to crumble, especially in education, of course in entertainment, in sports recreation, in places of public gathering. And proceeding into the 1960s amidst the escalating U.S. involvement in Vietnam, a series of developments nationally provided the opportunity for Dr. King to move from Montgomery and the Montgomery bus boycott to center stage, to being the most visible and tactically shrewd leader of the aggressive civil rights initiative of the time. It's not my intent here to detail in any way, shape, or form the associated events of that period from roughly the mid-1950s through the 1960s. The violent and oftentimes brutal response by those who opposed civil rights initiatives in this country. Greensboro, South Carolina, Birmingham, Alabama, the 1963 Dr. King's now famous letter from Birmingham Jail, which Dexter will talk about later. The Great March on Washington and Dr. King's speech in the Capitol's Mall, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, King receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize, the Selma to Montgomery, Alabama March, and the bloody crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, riots across the nation in response to the television coverage of the brutality of the Selma Montgomery March, the Watts section of Los Angeles, most famous utter devastation, Dr. King's murder in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. In Oklahoma, we did our part in contributing to the events that allowed Dr. King to play his increasingly preeminent role in the national movement. Backed by the inveterate black Oklahoma newspaper publisher and civil rights activist Roscoe Dunjee in 1948 in the case Sipule versus Oklahoma State Board of Regents, the United States Supreme Court ordered the University of Oklahoma, a school of law, to allow Ada Lois Sipule to enroll as its first African American student. Ada Lois was a Chickasha native. In turn, in 1950, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the University of Oklahoma to admit its first African American student, a young man by the name of George W. McLaren. In 1955, the just elected Governor Raymond Gary led amending the Constitution, the Oklahoma Constitution, 1955, integrating Oklahoma public schools, this in response to the historic 1954 Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Also in 1955, Oklahoma's segregated all-black Douglas High School played all-white Capitol Hill High School for the state championship. It was the first integrated football game ever played in Oklahoma. 10,000 people attended that game, and many more saw it on television. Douglas won. And Prentice Gott was Douglas's star halfback. Legendary coach Bud Wilkinson recruited him to play at the University of Oklahoma, thus integrating Oklahoma sports for the first time. He was named an All-American in 1959. Clara Looper, an African-American teacher at Douglas High School, Oklahoma's legendary civil rights leader, first used the nonviolent sit-in tactic as a means to integrate commercial establishments. All-white lunch counters, in this case the Katz drugstores in Oklahoma City. Within days, Katz agreed to drop the color line in all its stores nationally, and it was Clara Looper's use of this tactic that set the model for that tactic being used throughout the 1960s in this country. In Tulsa, a number of successes, black activists joined, especially with white allies centered in the All Souls Unitarian Church. The All Souls remains, I believe, the largest Unitarian church west of the Mississippi River, if I'm not mistaken, I think, but I'm not sure. And here, at the Oklahoma College for Women, a courageous Chickasha woman, Clydia Trillier, in October 1954, filed against OCW for denial of admission the month before. The brief of filing included Chickasha native and now Chickasha attorney Ada Sipule, graduated from OU Law School on a team led by Thurgood Marshall, who would later be appointed as a sitting judge on the United States Supreme Court. OCW's Board of Regents requested advice from the Oklahoma State Regents for Higher Education, and as a result, in June of 1955, the state regents directed all state colleges and universities to accept, and I quote, qualified Negro students, end quote, who might wish to enroll. Integration of the Oklahoma state system of higher education started here at your college. Well, this is kind of the scenario of the times, both nationally, the context nationally, and here in Oklahoma. A brief sketch, and not altogether coherent, but a sketch that now I want to respond to by doing three things in ending my comments. I want to talk about the personal significance, or I should say the significance of this day from a personal or a family standpoint. And second, the significance of this day, the importance of this day from the standpoint of this college. And thirdly, the significance of this day, the importance of this day for all of us in this room. First, on the personal side of things, I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma in the 1950s and the 1960s. My family was extensively involved in the affairs of the community and the affairs of the state nationally. My father he occupied the Kingfisher Chair of Philosophy of Religion and Ethics at the University of Oklahoma, and my uncle Kenneth was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church. Father was also an ordained minister. Both were very extensively involved in ecumenical initiatives to encourage and sustain interfaith dialogue involving Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities at that time. That also involved interracial congregations, interethnic congregations. Both were very involved with the African American community and the black leader luminaries of the state. Both were very close friends with Clara Luper and other leaders in the NAACP. My father also was involved with the American Indian communities of Oklahoma, close friends with Fred and LaDonna Harris, a Comanche, who formed Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity, and later in Washington, D.C., Americans for Indian Opportunity. Both Fred and LaDonna mentioned in the course of the volatile politics of the 1970s as potential presidential candidates. My father was part of the originating group that created the Oklahoma Southwest Center for Human Relations in Norman, concerned with paying candid and bold attention to the priorities and needs and the value of all ethnic, racial, and religious groups in the state of Oklahoma. My father was a close advisor to George Lynn Cross, president of the University of Oklahoma, and constantly advised of the terrible importance of integrating the public domain, especially education, the terrible importance of educating all of Oklahoma's resources. With the Vietnam War raging through the last half of the 1960s, my two cousins in Norman, Edward Feaver and Eric Feaver, were both extensively involved in the anti-war movement. And the anti-war movement was very much related to the civil rights initiatives of the time, based on the argument and reality that the draft was very slanted in favoring those with the means to qualify for deferment, slanted against those without those means, the poor, the less fortunate, the minorities, who in disproportionate numbers were sent into combat. And against other peoples of color, the war raised all nature of questions about the civil, the human rights of those involved in the war, all peoples involved in the war. One cousin, a graduate of New York's Union Seminary, an ordained minister, was with Yale's Sloan Coffin, and on the steps of the nation's capital in the late 1960s, destroyed their draft cards in a highly publicized anti-war protest. He later moved to Georgia to help black sharecroppers organize economic cooperatives. There were attempts on his life there. Another cousin, formerly registered as a conscientious objector, eventually went to Vietnam as a field medic and saw some of the worst carnage of the war. I opposed the war. I was not an activist, but thought service appropriate. I went into the Peace Corps, bound for the Philippines. I was drafted and had a choice either of avoiding the draft or serving, and thought that if I tried to avoid, they would simply fill my position with some inner city kids, so I went to Vietnam as part of a helicopter medical evacuation unit. So, my stake in the times and significance of Dr. King, that of my family, it is a legacy that affects me profoundly today. And it is one. It is one that guides my sense of responsibility for this college. My sense of what this college, this type of college, must do if to succeed in its mission and to serve the interests of its students, the best interests of the community and the state in which it exists, and to anguish in its failure to do so. Of course, the college must serve to tutor, to enhance the ability to teach skills that an individual need to foster financial, physical, and psychological well-being to the best of his or her ability, to provide the means to a successful livelihood of self, family, community, and society. Jobs are important, careers are important, incomes, paying bills, investments, comfortable retirement, they're terribly important. But this college, if to serve its purpose as well, must equally succeed in its provision of the knowledge necessary to operate successfully as a creative part of the Commonwealth, as a part of a democratic society. Really to come as much as possible to realize what it means to be a human part of the human whole. Responsibilities, commitments, obligations on the one hand, freedoms, liberties, rights on the other, understanding the balance and the relationship of these things as a creative participant in the affairs of our democratic Commonwealth and our Commonwealth's participation in global affairs. Responsibilities and rights to self, to family, to community, to humanity. What are they, and what balance must we achieve if to become the best of what we are capable of being as human beings? This really is what Dr. King was talking about in his time. He focused, yes, on the need of the time, from his perspective, the civil deficiencies of black Americans, their enormous disadvantage born of the racial segregation of their circumstances, most dramatically manifest in the southern states, in the cities, the ghettos of the cities. But what he really was saying was timeless. Having respect for African Americans meant and means having respect for life, the importance of life, treating life as worthy of having rights, civil rights in the more narrow sense, but the right of health and well-being ultimately. Well, following from that, in terms of what I believe the college must focus on, in terms of sending graduates out into the world, armed with what kinds of information and perspective and understanding. What does the significance of this day mean for all of us here in terms of our lives? We will all be dealing with the question of rights, human rights, for our entire lives. It will never be off the screen of our concern. And there is the potential to deal with the question both creatively, or on the one hand creatively and constructively, or on the other hand to deal with these questions quite negatively, reactively and destructively. It must be the latter we must endeavor to avoid. The questions will be constantly on the edge of all our social, political, economic, and cultural endeavors, our environmental endeavors. Are rights a public good, or are they a private good? If to have rights, do we have to earn them, or are they ours inherently so? Do animals have rights? Rights not to be treated cruelly? Do life forms have rights because as a species, as part of the biosphere, they contribute to its overall, if yet not always understood, good? Oklahoma is among the most unhealthy places in the United States in 30 different categories, health and poor health related categories. We're in the bottom 10% of all states. and just barely above the bottom 10% in a number of other categories. Should all Oklahomans have the right to a minimum quality of health care support? Who should have voting rights? Should all Oklahomans have the right to obtain training or education essential to their earning a livable wage? What are the rights of employees to grievance, the rights of children, the rights of religious belief? Property rights, water rights, whose rights? Environmental rights, climate warming, pollution, safe drinking water, whose rights? Tobacco-free environment, whose rights? The right to carry firearms, whose rights? What is the limit to the right of free speech, the Paris massacre? Whose rights should we be concerned about here in Chickasha? The rights of Haitians, the rights of Chinese, the rights of Nigerians. Next Monday, as Zach Simpson, the Abelson Chair, have invited Hind Kabawat to campus to talk about Syrian rights, among other things. What are the rights of Palestinians? What are the rights of Israelis? What are the rights of immigrants, legal and illegal? What should their rights be? The rights of protesters and demonstrators, the rights of gay and lesbian couples to marry and to raise families, of transsexuals, the right of prisoners, the right of those released on parole. This is what Martin Luther King Day is really about. To take stock of how well we focus as a commonwealth, as a democratic people, on the question of human rights as it affects the totality of our being. Martin Luther King helped forge an alliance of events and people at a particular time in this nation's history, an alliance focused on correcting a particular set of injustices affecting a particular people. But this day, his day, in celebration, in my best judgment, should be used as a recommitment to a cause which he would join with the greatest enthusiasm, a recommitment to a constant attention to the question of human rights, of the rights of living things.
Well, I think you'll see that Dr. Feaver has thrown out a number of questions for continuous pondering, and I may do the same thing, and we hope that you will contribute something here. Raise issues with us, argue with us, agree with us, whatever, but contribute your personal slant. You may even take us down some paths that we had not contemplated. The topic was, why do we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day? There are many answers, some a bit mundane, and some a bit more lofty. And first, let me dispense with the mundane. In November 1983, President Reagan signed an act of Congress creating a federal holiday for federal employees. This law did not bind state governments with regard to state employees, but numerous states followed. In Oklahoma, there are observances, but no mandatory state holiday for state employees. And here, we're engaged in a voluntary observance. The foregoing, however, does not amount to a compelling reason for celebrating Dr. King. For me, and I include myself in the we of this title, Dr. King was a giant of intellect, of will, of conviction, of integrity, of organization, and of commitment. He was a formative influence on my views of what was right as proper goals, and perhaps much more important, what were proper means to achieve those goals. I stress ends and means. One of the core, timeless, critical, ethical questions that plagues humans is, does the end ever justify the means? The means used to achieve that end. For example, assuming that torture is highly effective in eliciting magnificently relevant, accurate, and useful information, I would suggest that's a dubious proposition, but let's go ahead and grant that. Can torture be justified to achieve the end of acquiring that information? Can reaching a moral end ever justify immoral means employed to achieve that end? Or Is this a purely circumstantial question based upon weighing the extent of the harm against the specific harm of the means against the extent of the resulting good from the end? And if utilitarian factors are to be considered, are moral means ultimately more effective in achieving moral ends? I hope that our professors and our curriculum have challenged and will continue to challenge our students with that issue throughout their sojourn here. Yeah, let me know if they're not, okay? And for those of you who have an interest in mathematics, consult Dr. Tran or Dr. Cook about the mathematical concept of limits and ponder what is more important, the end or the path to that end. You may develop additional insights into both life and mathematics. With this in mind, it's fitting that we celebrate Dr. King's Day in January rather than during Black History Month in February, because Dr. King's life and message transcend race relations. Although the specific struggle with which he is most notably connected is legally based discrimination against African Americans, to restrict his impact to this literal specific is an injustice. And so I plan to share a few of my own experiences that might provide a filter for your contemplation of your own experiences, and perhaps such interaction will result in new understandings for all of us. I entered college at Stanford University in California in the fall of 1962. Although I grew up in a thoroughly segregated city of Dallas, Texas, I was blessed with the firm injunction from my family never to use the N-word and to consider all human beings to be full-fledged human beings, a somewhat novel idea for that place and time. And partly as a result of that background in college, I pledged a fraternity that had been expelled from its national organization for having committed the sin of admitting both non-Christian and non-white members. I also engaged in a freedom ride of my own by driving home from California in June of 1964 with my black fraternity brother, Ira Hall, who lived in Oklahoma City. Ira had been one of the first black persons to integrate the Oklahoma City public schools. On that journey home, we were stopped by the whole highway patrol in Southern California for the twin sins of driving while black and driving with a white person in the car. Even though Ira, who was driving, was diligently driving under 5 miles under the speed limit in a valiant attempt to avoid being stopped for the twin sins of driving while black and driving with a white person in the car. Accordingly, I experienced, if only indirectly, the incredible burden of racial profiling. And for my comment on racism, I say that even today, if you do not understand that a constant concern of virtually every black person is that they are and will be literally faced with the moral equivalent of being stopped for driving while black. And if you lack that understanding, you're missing the empathy that a liberal arts education should foster. I could go on with numerous specific personal stories in microcosm during the 60s and 70s and beyond, but that's not why I celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Instead, I hark back to a class in Western civilization, a course required of all undergraduates at Stanford, in late April 1963. I vividly remember that the instructor brought a copy of Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King just after the letter had been published. King had been jailed for violating a court injunction issued in Birmingham, Alabama, against parading, boycotting, and picketing. While he was in jail, a group of moderate white Alabama clergymen from across the Judeo-Christian spectrum published a letter criticizing King for having violated the law. With nothing else to do in solitary confinement, King responded with letter from the Birmingham Jail. Now, among the criticisms and suggestions of the moderate clergymen were primarily the following. First, Dr. King and his followers should refrain from breaking the law. And second, that Dr. King should engage in negotiation rather than demonstrations. King responded with a number of points, and this is quite heady stuff. For one, he distinguished between a just law and an unjust law. King wrote, "A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God." Continuing, "Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust." Further, he said, "An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels on a minority group. It compels the minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. A just law is a code that the majority compels a minority to follow, and that it is willing to follow itself." Using this analysis, Dr. King concluded that all laws, duly enacted as they may have been, all laws that establish and perpetuate segregation were and are unjust. Such laws were enacted and enforced by a white majority against a disenfranchised black minority. Such laws degrade black human beings. The white majority simply were not burdened by those laws. And as but one example of the effect, he wrote, how do you explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television? How do you do that? The next question involves the proper response to such unjust law. Possibilities included simple acquiescence by all. And King said that's what they'd been doing for 340 years, and not much was happening. Another possibility, violent reaction by the dispossessed group. And this was a course that King firmly rejected. Instead, King advocated nonviolent action, perhaps the most difficult avenue to follow. Nonviolent action customarily invites a violent response from those who want to maintain the status quo. Nonviolent action requires the ultimate of self-control. And yet, King asserted that nonviolent action was the only viable path. And King stated, "One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law." In pursuit of that strategy, King conducted a series of workshops on nonviolent direct action. He insisted that followers absolutely commit to an affirmative response to the following questions. 1, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? And are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? The workshops also included practicing protection of vital parts of the body as blows were delivered. As for the need for action, King pointed out that he was unaware of situations where privileged groups had given up their privileges voluntarily. He observed freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed. And King insisted that he tried to occupy the middle ground between do-nothingism and the hatred and despair of the black nationalist. He feared that unless white moderates assisted his efforts, millions of Negroes will, out of frustration and despair, seek solace and security in black nationalist ideologies. Indeed, King wrote, if repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. King's strategy of nonviolent direct action also spoke to the criticism of the white moderate clergyman for King's failure to negotiate. As a former practicing lawyer, I can assure you that I had a viable negotiating position only if I had something the other side wanted. The reality of disruption of commerce by nonviolent, peaceful protesting was the only real bargaining chip that King could develop. Violence can also develop a bargaining chip, and the bargain is, if you give in to what I want, I will cease the violence. The problem is that violence generally produces a highly negative reaction in the society at large that diminishes its value and ultimately serves as a barrier to negotiation. In the 1960s, violence by black nationalists was so hated that even the National Rifle Association favored gun control. Violence by black nationalists won little sympathy from the society as a whole. Violence in America generally is counterproductive. On the other hand, pictures on television of peaceful demonstrators, a tactic pioneered, again here in Oklahoma by Ms. Looper. Pictures on TV of demonstrators curled up in the street to protect themselves, being clubbed, beaten, and water hosed by police, evoked sympathy from the society at large. And this was a huge bargaining chip in the negotiations that led to the monumental civil rights legislation of the 1960s. It required patience and fortitude and a long-term view, so often missing from our present obsession with short-term goals. The universalism of the letter from the Birmingham Jail transcends the specific injustice. King practiced what he preached with the full expectation of suffering martyrdom. He pursued elimination of injustice through nonviolence. He was murdered for his message. We celebrate such people.